Hello, and thank you for joining us. This is the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing's live call-in show. And today we will be talking specifically about tenants in foreclosure issues. My name is Patricia Frahn. I work in our Tenants in Foreclosure Intervention Project. And here with me today is Frank Avalon, one of our staff attorneys. Frank, do you want to let us know a little bit about what you do at Lawyers Committee for Better Housing?
Sure, Trish. Well, I'm the lead attorney that works with court cases for tenants whose buildings have been in foreclosure. And I also help other people in our unit that do different things for tenants whose buildings are in foreclosure. We do a wide variety of things for folks in that genre. And Trish, maybe you could tell the folks a little bit about what we do there.
Sure, definitely. But just first, as a reminder, this is a live call-in show. We invite you to call in with any questions you might have, specifically about foreclosure and what that means for renters in foreclosure. And the number is 312-738-1060. So please, again, call in if you do have any questions. And I'm going to run through some of the programs, just in general, that we have at the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing. We have several programs, including eviction defense, affordable housing preservation, which includes buildings conditions issues, utility shutoffs, things of that nature. And what we're going to be focusing on today, tenants in foreclosure. A lot of people think foreclosure and they think that means specifically homeowners. We're talking about the impacts of renters in foreclosure. And what our program does is we represent tenants who may be in court due to foreclosure. We address, again, conditions issues, utility issues during foreclosure. And we have a counseling line for renters in foreclosure if they want to find out, is their building in foreclosure, what stage of the process it's in, and what that means specifically for them. We also have a tenant advocacy project, which deals with issues that may not need litigation services, but do need advocacy from an attorney.
You know, Trish, I think that one interesting thing that you do and people in your office do is collect data about the effect of foreclosure on renters. And, you know, when you look at that data, I think it shows some very interesting things that are quite surprising to many people. And I wonder if you could share with the folks some of the data that you know.
I would love to share some of our data with you. So let me bring this up here. Hopefully this is viewable for folks at home. So we've been collecting data for about 5 years now on foreclosure filings, specifically on apartment buildings in Chicago. And what we found was that from 2009 to 2012, 2,279 apartment buildings have entered foreclosure. Those buildings contained a total of 61,561 units. And this makes up 11% of Chicago's total rental housing stock.
And you know what's surprising to me about that figure, Trish, is that many times, because the foreclosure process takes so long, many times landlords walk away from the properties or the properties become vacant. And actually what we're seeing here is some numbers that reflect the loss of rental housing in Chicago. Right. And that affects the price of rent for the units that do remain. And that's why Chicago's going to be a more and more expensive place to live.
And that's something we're all feeling, regardless of income level, is that increase in rent. I just want to direct folks to this map that we have here. So that map is foreclosure filings only on apartment buildings in Chicago and only for the year 2012. So clearly this is a huge issue for the city of Chicago and all renters in Chicago. And Frank, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on, well, what is the foreclosure process? What is the timeline of foreclosure? And what does that mean for renters? What are some rights and responsibilities that renters have?
Well, that's right. And while we're not really dealing with mortgage holders that have defaulted on their mortgage and are going through foreclosure, the foreclosure process does have a big impact on tenants. The foreclosure process, at an absolute minimum, most people don't know, is quite lengthy. Right. The person that holds the mortgage, your landlord, has at least 7 months in the foreclosure case at court to get copacetic with the property. And so the foreclosure case is going to take at a minimum of 7 months. In Cook County, these cases are typically taking 18 months, sometimes much longer. Right. And anytime during that process, it's quite possible that your landlord might float in and out of their relationship with you, sometimes quite early. The landlord has really stopped being the landlord for all practical purposes, and tenants are frequently stuck for a very long period of time trying to figure out who to pay the rent to, who do you call for repairs. It gets the sheer length of time gets to cause all sorts of practical difficulties.
Right, and those are some horror stories, I guess, that we've seen and we're familiar with. But let's say that doesn't happen. What is the typical during the foreclosure process? What are renters' rights and responsibilities? What are landlords' rights and responsibilities if everyone is doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Yeah. Well, without getting too complicated about it, when you talk to a lawyer, there's never a black and white. It's always a shade of gray. But just to be very basic about it, people need to very clearly understand that the landlord is still your landlord during the foreclosure process, and your obligations as a tenant still run to that landlord. Many people we find in the community are under the misconception that just because a property is in foreclosure that you don't have to pay your rent to the landlord anymore. In a sense, it seems commonsensical. Gee, if you're paying your landlord and the landlord isn't paying for his mortgage, why should you be paying the landlord, people feel? Well, understandably, but nevertheless, you're the tenant, the obligations to the landlord, and whether he spends your money on the mortgage or not is beside the point. You don't want to find yourself getting evicted for non-payment of rent, which can be a very speedy and difficult process for tenants.
Because landlords still retain the rights to file evictions even if they are in foreclosure. And that's something that tenants should be aware of, that you're basically risking an eviction, what you don't want to have on your record, if you choose to not pay rent while the landlord's in foreclosure.
And of course, what Trish is referring to when she talks about your record is really your credit report. The big three credit reporting agencies and the 200 some minor credit reporting agencies that cater to landlords and employers, they will commonly call the public records, including those of the court, and put on your credit report lawsuits that have been going on. So if you can avoid having an eviction lawsuit on your credit report, that's helpful.
Definitely. So what is the point then? When will you know that your landlord has actually lost the property due to foreclosure?
Well, that's right. The foreclosure process isn't entirely intuitive, so there gets to be a point in time in the foreclosure court case against your landlord where the judge will declare the property foreclosed, but that's not the end of it, because then there's supposed to then be a public sale of the house at a judicial auction. And these days, because of the foreclosure crisis since 2008, many times it's the bank that buys the property at foreclosure. It doesn't have to be that way, but it frequently works out that way. But then it's not over yet for your landlord, because then several weeks after the auction, the case has to come back to the judge, who puts his final blessing on the auction at something called the confirmation of sale. And it's at that point that the landlord loses all of his interests in the real estate and is no longer your landlord. But right up to that confirmation of sale, your obligations are to that person you've been dealing with right along and not to anybody new.
Right, and I think that's where things get a little bit confusing, because sometimes you can see public records that a sale is about to occur or has occurred, and it seems like, well, there's a sale, so doesn't that mean that my landlord's lost the property? But it does require that final step in the court process. And we do have a caller. So, hello, caller.
Hi, yes.
Hi, do you have a question about foreclosure?
I do. I have known for a while that my building is in foreclosure, but recently my landlord stopped answering my phone calls. And the other day, there was a water shut-off notice on my building. If I can't reach my landlord, what am I supposed to do?
Trish, I'm sure you get calls like this all the time on our foreclosure counseling line. What typically would you tell people about that?
That is a very good question, and it is something that comes up quite frequently, unfortunately. So I think it's important to first find out, well, where is your building at in the foreclosure process? And that's kind of what Frank and I have been talking about these last couple of minutes. So it might make sense to find out, well, does my landlord still in fact own the property? Has there been a sale? Is there a new owner? So finding out who is responsible, because throughout that whole foreclosure process, your landlord is still responsible to maintain the property. So if this is the case where the landlord still owns the property, is in possession of the property, and you just can't get a hold of them, they're completely missing, they've abandoned the property, there are a couple of immediate things that you can do. For instance, call, if you live in Chicago, 311. and report the problem. You can also work directly, and this is with any utility issue, work directly with the utility company to keep the utilities on. And that typically should not require you to have to pay any back amount that the landlord failed to pay. They will typically work out something with you to just keep the water on while you're living there. Frank, is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, and it's so difficult because a tenant that's really faced with an absentee landlord and from foreclosure, taking over the utility bill yourself, that's a new financial burden that you weren't expecting and you're not even obligated for, but sometimes you're put in that tough position of either having water or not.
Right.
And as Trish said, the utility company shouldn't ask you to pay for the arrearages, but moving forward they might. So that's always a difficult thing.
And that's something that, keep all records of it and deduct from what you would typically pay for rent. So it wouldn't be, you're paying your rent to your landlord and then on top of that, taking on these new payments. It would be deducting from the rent if the landlord's completely inaccessible and keeping all kinds of track records that you've been doing so. And if the foreclosure has concluded, let's say the bank now owns the property, they're now the landlord and they're required to take on all the responsibilities that your previous landlord had.
And I think that's a really difficult point. A lot of people, including many of the banks themselves, feel as though that they're not the landlord. They don't want the responsibility of a landlord, which is why many times a bank who buys a property at foreclosure won't even demand the rent from tenants because they feel like if they take the rent that somehow they're your landlord. Well, I'm sorry, they are your landlord. They're the ones that you should be paying. They're the ones now that they're the new owners who have the responsibility of landlords to make repairs, maintain the utilities, whatever your landlord-tenant relationship was about. Whether they like it or not, that's the arrangement. And you should be able to look to that new owner to satisfy their obligations.
Right, and what we've also found through our data analysis is that 86% of the time in these foreclosure sales, it is in fact a bank who is taking over the property and who is becoming a landlord in this situation. So if we can just go through a little bit, what are the responsibilities of this new owner to the tenant? What do they have to do once they gain possession of the property?
Mm-hmm. Well, ideally, and what the law really anticipates, is that the new owner would send a notice of a change of management to the tenants announcing, hey, we're the owners of this property. Here's how we got to be the owners. Here's the contact information for you to get a hold of us in case you need repairs and even preferably to pay the rent as well. And so you ought to know who the new owner is. The new owner has an obligation to figure out what's going on with their property, who lives there, why they're there, how long they've been there. And I think many times that poses a difficulty, particularly where the bank is the buyer. They don't really want to be your landlord. They're only going to have the property for a relatively short period of time before they sell it. And certainly the new city ordinance and organizations like ours want the banks to get the properties in the hands of final owners who are going to manage it as landlords and be responsible for it that way. So they should first announce to you that they're the owners, and they should make a diligent effort to find out who's living there.
Right, definitely. And speaking of this new ordinance, what are some of the protections out there for tenants, and what is the timeline post foreclosure? How long does a renter have to live in the property?
Well, that's right. There, the new ordinance that Trish makes mention of is an important piece that became effective in Chicago starting September the 24th of this year. Now, some of you have heard that that includes the possibility of having your lease renewed for a period of time, or the bank can pay you relocation assistance. The relocation assistance figure is rather generous. Mm-hmm. But a couple of things to remember. First of all, this new ordinance only applies where the foreclosure confirmation of sale that we talked about earlier happens after September the 24th. So if the bank got a hold of your landlord's building last March, December of 2012, this new ordinance doesn't apply to them. It only applies to buildings that have finished the foreclosure process after September the 24th. The other big thing to remember that I think is going to be a little bit difficult for people to get their head around is it's not going to be the tenant's choice about whether to continue being a tenant in the building or whether to take the relocation assistance cash. That's a choice that the new owner has, and they should really properly give you full disclosure about that choice. As a matter of fact, the ordinance requires that choice be presented to the tenants in multilingual written disclosures. Chinese, Spanish, Polish, etc. And so we'll see how it plays out. It's brand new. There are lots of issues that we're tracking around that. There's unanswered questions. But that basic choice of staying on as a tenant or taking relocation assistance is going to have to be presented to the tenant by the bank, and we'll see how it works.
Right, and I think, like you had mentioned, these notice requirements, they have become a little more strict with the new ordinance. And I think it's important for renters to take any notices that you receive seriously. I've spoken with tenants who they'll get a notice from the bank, who's the new owner. The landlord wants to attempt to continue to collect rent, so they'll tell them to disregard it. And I would just suggest don't disregard any notices that you might get posted on your door, get in the mail, or delivered to you personally. If they're alerting you to the fact that there's a new owner, definitely look into that matter, because to qualify for full protection under the new ordinance, you have to make sure that you're kind of working with the bank and establishing that new landlord-tenant relationship and abiding by all your renter responsibilities, including paying rent to the new owner.
Well, and the nice thing about the new ordinance is that if the bank chooses to let you stay on and renew your lease, the rent can only be increased by 102% of where it was, and then only 2% per year thereafter. So this is nice because it's going to prevent the new owner from escalating your rent as a mechanism of depriving you of the choice whether to continue on.
Right, definitely. So for tenants who maybe aren't covered by this new ordinance, let's say they live outside of Chicago, or for whatever reason they don't otherwise qualify for the ordinance, what are their baseline protections when they're in foreclosure?
Well, let's be very clear that the new owners in Illinois for quite a number of years, when somebody buys your property, whether they buy it on the open market through a real estate agent, or they buy the property at a foreclosure sale, either way, they are taking that property subject to your lease. Simply stated, they are your new landlord. And if for some reason they don't want you to be living there anymore, there's proper, very traditional ways of working with tenants. If you have a long-term lease that survives the purchase, the foreclosure, the new owner is supposed to respect that. And this new city ordinance reinforces that, but that's always been true in Illinois law for quite a number of years, back to 1989, certainly since 1993. They have to respect your lease. The new laws make it a little bit more complicated about how that respect is supposed to happen and what really qualifies as a legitimate lease. And we're going to see some debates about that. And we're going to see some, unfortunately, lawsuits about that. But that's an emerging issue now, whether or not your lease is bona fide, whether or not it qualifies, whether or not it's legitimate. So sometimes even those things that are passed to protect tenants have some unintended consequences that can make life difficult for tenants. So we're going to see how that plays out.
All right. Well, I believe we have a caller. Caller, are you there?
Hi. Thank you guys so much for doing this show. This is great information. I have a question for you. I'm a renter, and I live in a building, and I think it's in foreclosure. And my landlord's still coming and asking me for rent. But if he's not paying his mortgage, I don't see why I should pay my rent. So what should I do in this situation?
Yeah, we covered a little bit of that before, but I think the critical point is understanding where in the foreclosure process this really is. And if there are definite ways that you, of your own initiative, can figure that out. And I think Trish might help us in going through that a little bit. But in the last analysis, you can call us, the numbers that we're going to post later in the show, or organizations like ours, in order to figure out exactly where in the foreclosure process it is. Because again, all the way up to the confirmation of sale that happens after the sale of your property in foreclosure, that old landlord still has the right to be collecting rent. But after that point, no. They don't have the right to be collecting it, and you really should be careful about paying somebody after that magic moment in time has passed.
Right, and if you want to know, what's going on with your property, is it in foreclosure? There are several resources, both online or over the phone, that you can call. For instance, Lawyers Committee for Better Housing is a resource, and I will be posting our number up, but it's 312-784-3507 is for foreclosure counselings. You can also take the initiative yourself to go online, Cook County Recorder of Deeds, and what you're looking for is a lis pendens. And it, after, I believe, 2011, foreclosure-related lis pendens, which means that a lawsuit is pending, they specifically say lis pendens foreclosure. And if you click on the document, you can get the case number for the foreclosure. And from there, you can go to the Cook County Clerk of Courts website and use the case number to look up the foreclosure online docket, which is in Chancery courts. And it's kind of confusing. There's going to be a lot of, it'll probably be a lengthy docket, and there's going to be a lot of information on there that you may not understand. But what you're looking for, if you want to determine if the foreclosure has concluded, what you're looking for is that confirmation of sale in order for possession, and the order for possession which is entered against the landlord typically, and the confirmation of sale. So the court is recognizing the sale that probably occurred maybe a month or a couple months prior to that, and the court is recognizing it. And that's the point at which your landlord loses rights to the property. And again, if you have any questions about navigating these different websites, you can definitely call Lawyers Committee for Better Housing, and we can help you out with that.
And I'd like you to get a piece of paper and a pen ready, because we're going to post not only our number, but some other resources as well. And one resource that I'm very high on is Illinois Legal Aid Online. All of the legal aid programs, including ours statewide, band together several years ago. And we have this marvelous website that has marvelous resources and a wide variety of things. Domestic relations, consumer rights, bankruptcy law, tenants' rights, a wide variety of things that have cookbook ideas about how you can not only know your rights but pursue them, model letters, sample documents. It has lots of resources on there. We're going to post that website for you, and there are some foreclosure-related things for renters on that website as well.
Great. And did you have any follow-up questions, caller?
No, I think that was everything. Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
All right, great. Well, I guess, Frank, as we're winding down, are there some major takeaways that you want renters out there who are watching to know regarding foreclosure?
Yeah, I think just a couple of things. Most people should understand that in maybe just some practical nuts and bolts things about what happens when the new owner takes over, many times from a foreclosure sale. Almost every kind of tenant or occupant is entitled to a 90-day notice before they can be kicked out or evicted from where they're living. So be on the lookout for that. We almost always recommend to make yourself known. The new owner or the bank should not be demanding all sorts of documentation from you about all sorts of things, your citizenship or your utility bills or your history of rent payment, but they should want to see your lease, and you should want to show that to them if you have one, so they understand who you are and why you're there, so that they respect your rights.
Definitely.
So that's an important point.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure everyone gets these numbers who is watching. These are the Lawyer Committee for Better Housing hotlines or helplines. If you're being evicted, if your building's in foreclosure, if you may have some other housing issues. So please feel free to give us a call if you do have questions. And we will be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
While you're writing down that number, why don't we just leave that there for a bit, Trish, because it's important to write that down, but also IllinoisLegalAidOnline.org.
Thank you. Oh, and thank you for joining us, and we will be on next Friday to discuss some other very important housing legal issues. Thank you.